My name is Savannah, and I need you to understand something before I tell you this story. I wanted to love Deborah. I genuinely, truly, with everything I had as a 9-year-old little girl who had just lost her mama to cancer, I wanted to love her. She had this warm laugh, these soft hands. She smelled like vanilla, and she always had gum in her purse, and she let me pick the radio station in the car. I thought God had sent me somebody. I was wrong. For 15 years, Deborah Lynn Carter put on the greatest performance I have ever witnessed up close. Loving stepmother, devoted wife, pillar of the community. And the morning after my daddy's funeral, before the casserole dishes had even been picked up from the porch, she sat me down at the kitchen table in the house I grew up in and told me exactly who she had always been. I was 31 years old. I had a job, a lease, a life. I thought I could handle whatever she said. I could not handle what she said. But what I did after, that part, I handled just fine. My daddy's name was Robert Earl Mitchell. Bobby to everyone who loved him, which was most of Beaumont, Texas. He was a big man with a bigger laugh and the kind of handshake that made you feel like everything was going to be okay. He coached Little League for 22 years. He could fix anything with a roll of duct tape and a butter knife. He cried at the end of every single Hallmark movie and dared anyone to say something about it. My mama, Charlotte, died of breast cancer in March of 1997. I was 9. My brother Cooper was 6. For 2 years, it was just the three of us, Daddy, me, and Cooper, rattling around that house on Elmwood Drive with a rotating cast of casseroles from church ladies and a daddy who tried so hard to be everything that sometimes I'd catch him sitting at the kitchen table at midnight just staring at nothing. I'd go sit with him. We never had to say anything. That was enough. Deborah came into our lives through a friend of a friend at some 4th of July cookout in 1999. She was pretty in that polished, put-together way, never a hair out of place, nails always done, the kind of woman who brings store-bought brownies to a potluck but puts them on her own tray so it looks homemade. I didn't trust her immediately. I was 11. I had good instincts. But she was patient with me in a way that wore my defenses down. She never pushed. She never tried to replace my mama, at least not out loud. She'd ask about my mama's recipes. She framed one of Mama's photos and put it on the mantle. She came to every single one of my volleyball games in middle school and cheered louder than any of the other parents. By the time Daddy proposed, I cried at their engagement party, happy tears. I thought I finally had my family back. Cooper adored her from day one. He was only 6 when Mama died, so he had less to protect. He called her Mom within the first year. I never could quite get there, but I tried. Lord knows I tried.
The thing about a long con is that it doesn't come apart all at once. It happens in hairline fractures, moments so small you dismiss each one individually. It's only when you stand back and look at the whole wall that you see it's been crumbling for years. The first hairline fracture happened when I was 16. I'd gotten into an accelerated English program, a real honor, the kind of thing my mama would have made a whole production out of. I came home with the letter and Deborah looked at it, smiled, set it down on the counter and said, and I remember this word for word, "We'll have to make sure this doesn't affect your chores schedule." Not congratulations, not I'm so proud of you, the chores schedule. I told myself she was just being practical. The second fracture happened when I was 19, home from my first semester at UT Austin. I overheard her on the phone with her sister, her biological sister Tammy, who I had always found a little cold. She was talking about the house, about how Daddy had updated the deed when they got married, about how things would be handled when the time came. I stood in the hallway outside the kitchen for probably 2 full minutes. I went back to my room and told myself I had misunderstood. That is what manipulation does to you. It makes you distrust your own ears. The third fracture, the one that should have broken the whole wall open, happened when I was 25. I had been dating a man named Tyler Brooks for 2 years. Good man, steady man, the kind of man who shows up. We were getting serious, and I was happy in a way I hadn't been in a long time. Deborah didn't like Tyler. She never said it directly, she was too smart for that, but she'd make little comments. "Wasn't he laid off for a while?" when Daddy asked about him. "I just hope you're not rushing things, Savannah," with this little concerned tilt of her head. "Some men are wonderful until they're not, honey," with a hand on my arm and those wide, sincere eyes. Tyler and I broke up 8 months later. I told myself the relationship just hadn't worked out. It was only after everything came apart that Tyler told me Deborah had called him directly, and told him that I was emotionally unstable from losing my mother, and that she was worried I was getting too attached too fast. She had told him this with the full authority of a concerned parent. He had been too young and too unsure of himself to ignore it. She had ended my relationship behind a curtain with a phone call while asking me at Sunday dinner how Tyler was doing.
My daddy was diagnosed with congestive heart failure in the spring of 2018. He was 64 years old. It didn't have to be a death sentence. With the right management, medication, diet, stress reduction, people live full lives with that diagnosis. The cardiologist at St. Elizabeth Hospital was clear about that. I drove down from Austin the weekend after the diagnosis, stayed for 3 weeks, set up a medication schedule, researched his dietary restrictions, went to his follow-up appointments with him. Deborah was present for all of this, gracious, attentive, playing the devoted wife beautifully. But here's what I noticed in those 3 weeks. Daddy was stressed. Not about his health, about money. He'd mention it in oblique ways. "Gotta get some things sorted out. Been meaning to talk to a few people. Deborah's been handling the finances. She's better at it than me." When I asked him directly, he'd change the subject. Daddy was the kind of man who didn't want his children worrying. I respected that and backed off. I should not have backed off. Over the next 2 years, I came home as often as I could. Daddy had good stretches and hard ones. Through all of it, Deborah was the picture of dedication, cooking his meals, driving him to appointments, giving health updates to the extended family via a group text she had set up, and that she administered, meaning she controlled what information went out and what didn't. My brother Cooper had moved to Nashville by then. He'd call Daddy every Sunday and call me every Wednesday to check in. He trusted Deborah completely. She was the one feeding him information. I had a creeping feeling I could not name and could not shake. Daddy passed on a Thursday morning in November of 2020. He was 66 years old. He died in the house on Elmwood Drive with Deborah beside him, which is what he would have wanted. I got the call at 6:47 a.m. I was in my car and on I-10 by 7:15. I didn't sleep for 2 days. I planned the funeral, I called the relatives, I made the food arrangements and the flower arrangements, and I wrote the obituary, because I knew my daddy's story better than anyone alive. Deborah floated through all of it like a beautiful, grieving ghost, present enough to be seen, absent enough to not have to do anything. And then, the morning after the funeral, she asked me to sit down at the kitchen table. She made coffee first. I remember that detail so clearly. The sound of the coffee maker, the specific, ordinary domesticity of it. Like this was just a morning. Like my daddy hadn't been buried 12 hours ago. She set a mug in front of me, and she sat down across the table, and she folded her hands, and she looked at me with those wide, sincere eyes. And then Deborah Lynn Carter, who had spent 15 years performing the role of loving stepmother, took off the costume.
She told me that Daddy's will had been updated 18 months ago, that the house on Elmwood Drive where I grew up, where my mama had planted the roses that still bloomed every April, where my daddy had put pencil marks on the doorframe measuring my height every birthday, had been left entirely to her. She told me that his life insurance, a policy he'd had since before he met her, had been updated to name her as sole beneficiary 3 years ago. She told me that the joint accounts, which had held the savings my daddy had built over 40 years of working at the refinery, she had added her name to them years earlier and had begun, over the past 18 months, systematically transferring funds to a separate account in her name only. She told me all of this calmly, with her hands folded, with that same expression she'd used when she asked about my chores schedule, when she'd expressed concern about Tyler, when she'd looked at my mama's photo on the mantel with borrowed grief. Then she said, and I will hear this sentence until I die, she said, "Bobby loved you very much, Savannah, but he was my husband, and this is my home now." I sat there with that coffee mug in my hands for what felt like a very long time. I was not going to cry in front of her. I made that decision in the first 5 seconds. I stood up, I said, "Thank you for the coffee, Deborah," and I walked out of that kitchen. I sat in my car in the driveway of the house I grew up in, and I called the one person I knew I needed. Not Cooper, not a friend, my daddy's attorney.
His name was Gerald Hoffman. He had handled my daddy's legal affairs for over 20 years. He had done the original will, the house deed, all of it. When I called him that morning, he was quiet for a moment after I explained what Deborah had told me. Then he said, "Savannah, I need you to come in. There are some things you should know." I was in his office by noon. What Gerald told me over the next 2 hours rearranged everything I thought I understood about the last 5 years of my daddy's life. The will had indeed been updated 18 months ago, but Gerald had not drafted that update. He had not been consulted. My daddy had, according to Deborah, used a different attorney for the update, an attorney in Lufkin who Gerald had never heard of. Gerald had spoken to my daddy about 6 months before he passed. Daddy had called him asking questions, vague questions, the kind a man asks when he's trying to understand something without admitting he doesn't understand it. Questions about whether a will could be changed without both parties knowing, about what undue influence meant legally. Gerald had asked him directly if everything was okay. Daddy had said yes. He had said yes because he was Robert Earl Mitchell, and he did not want his children worrying, and he believed he could handle his own affairs. Gerald and I sat in his office, and we looked at each other across his desk. And then Gerald said, "I think we need to have a conversation with a probate litigation attorney." I called Cooper from the parking lot of Gerald's office. I told him everything. Every fracture I had dismissed. Every instinct I had overridden, the phone call to Tyler, the controlled information in the group text, the kitchen table speech. Cooper was silent for a very long time. Then he said, "What do you need me to do?" That's my brother. We hired a probate litigation attorney named Patricia O'Coffer out of Houston. Patricia was the kind of woman who walked into a room and immediately became the most important person in it. Not loudly, just completely. Patricia spent the next 3 months building a case around one legal concept: undue influence. The argument that Deborah had systematically isolated my daddy, controlled his access to information, and manipulated him into changing his estate documents during a period when his health, and potentially his judgment, was compromised. What the investigation uncovered? The attorney in Lufkin who had drafted the updated will had met with my daddy only once. Deborah had been present for the entire meeting. My daddy had no independent legal counsel. The account transfers Deborah had made, moving funds from their joint accounts to her solo account over 18 months, had begun 4 months after Daddy's diagnosis. The timing was precise and documented. Three of Daddy's longtime friends, men he'd known for 30-plus years, provided statements saying that in the last 2 years of his life, Daddy had become increasingly difficult to reach, that Deborah had begun answering his phone, that when they did speak to him, he seemed not quite himself, and the detail that Patricia called the most significant. My daddy had called Gerald asking about undue influence 6 months before he died. That phone call existed in Gerald's records. He had known something was wrong. He had just been too proud and too protective to say it directly.
The case took 14 months. I won't pretend it was clean or easy, or that there weren't nights I sat on the floor of my apartment in Austin and cried until I had nothing left. There were. There were a lot of those nights. But Patricia was relentless, and Gerald was relentless, and Cooper flew down from Nashville every single time he was needed, without complaint, without hesitation. Every time. The court found sufficient evidence of undue influence to invalidate the updated will. My daddy's original will, the one Gerald had drafted, the one that divided the estate equally between Cooper and me, was reinstated as the controlling document. The account transfers were ruled improper. Deborah was ordered to return the transferred funds. The house on Elmwood Drive, where my mama planted roses that still bloom every April, where my daddy put pencil marks on the doorframe, came to Cooper and me. Deborah moved out on a Wednesday in January. I know because I was there. I didn't say anything to her. She walked past me with a box of her things, and I held the door open, and I watched her go. She turned around once at the end of the porch steps. She looked at me with those wide, sincere eyes. I looked right back. Neither of us said a word.
Cooper and I did not sell the house. We talked about it. The practical argument is there. Neither of us lives in Beaumont. The upkeep is real. It would make financial sense to sell. We're not selling it. I go back every April when the roses bloom. I sit on the porch with a cup of coffee and I talk to my daddy the way we used to sit at the kitchen table at midnight without having to say anything. I don't hate Deborah. I've worked hard to get to a place where I don't spend energy on that. What I feel is something cleaner, a kind of clarity that only comes from going through something and not letting it break you. My daddy loved me. He loved Cooper. Whatever she did to confuse and isolate him in those last years could not touch what was underneath. He called Gerald 6 months before he died, not knowing exactly what to do, but knowing something was wrong. He reached out to the one person he trusted with his legal affairs. He left a breadcrumb. He was still my daddy, right up until the end, still trying to protect us. Still Robert Earl Mitchell, who coached Little League for 22 years and cried at Hallmark movies and had the best handshake in Beaumont, Texas. I got the house. I got the roses. I got to keep him. She got nothing that was ever really hers. That's enough karma for me.